Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I am a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. So when reading the sacred scriptures against the backdrop of Catholic theology, sometimes we encounter just real difficult or dark passages to interpret, and one of them is the marriage of the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Joseph, because we have a high understanding of marriage as a natural institution, as a sacrament, and it doesn't seem like the bond between the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Joseph actually meets the standard or actually conforms to what is envisioned by that institution and or sacrament. So let's take a look at it. Here we go. Okay, so in order to understand the stakes, we have to describe first what marriage means in a Christian setting, but kind of more generally, I suppose. So the question then would be, what makes marriage, or what is marriage constituted by? Typically, people will start with the two ends of marriage, because if you know where a thing is going, then you can know what it is, or if you know what it's like made for, in effect, you can know then what it ought to be. So the two ends of marriage, as it's often described in the 20th and 21st centuries, are the good of the spouses or the mutual support of the spouses, and then the procreation and education of children. Now we'll get back to how those are articulated, or how those are related to each other, because it's not just like two ends on equal footing as if you had a choice of A or B or A and B. When, for instance, the church's documents, or like the Code of Canon Law describes marriage, it says that there are two essential properties to marriage: unity and indissolubility. And the unity piece people describe in a variety of ways. Some contemporary language which I find helpful is like comprehensive sharing. So you're meant to share your whole life, and that includes your sexual life. So then, what makes a marriage? Another good question, helpful again for kind of disambiguating the question and clarifying what's at stake. Well, in the West, it's the consent of the spouses which make the marriage. When I say in the West, I mean the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church. So you know that there are different rites, like the Roman Rite, and then that Roman Rite has different ritual expressions, like the Old Rite and the New Rite. But then you have the Eastern rites, and there's like 5 ritual families, but 21 different rites, I think, or 22, 21 different rites. So, but in the Roman Rite, it's the consent of the spouses which makes the marriage, in the presence of 2 witnesses and the officiant of the church, and that can be a bishop, priest, deacon, or a delegated layperson in certain circumstances. So they are consenting to a marriage, right? They're consenting to marriage as it's envisioned by the church, and they can't omit something which is essential to that vision. And in the ordinary course, right, sexual union is something that is essential to that vision. So then the way that this is addressed, like in the Code of Canon Law, for instance, is insisting upon consummation as making a marriage. So a marriage is made by the consent, right? But we speak of it as kind of further made, or yet more perfectly made, by consummation. Now, you may have heard that antecedent and perpetual impotence is an impediment to marriage. So if you can't consummate the marital act, and you know that ahead of time for whatever reason, usually some reason dealing with your sexual organs, the genitalia, then you're not able to even consent to the marriage, because you know in approaching it that you're not able to consummate it, and so that represents an obstacle that cannot be overcome. Now, that doesn't mean that you're infertile. That means that you just can't have sexual intercourse. So it's taking a step back there from considerations of infertility, which is why older couples can get married without any anticipation of conception, without any reasonable thought of conception, and yet younger couples who can't have sexual intercourse are not able to get married. Okay, so the church makes a distinction between a bond that is like ratified effectively by consent but not yet consummated. We would refer to this as ratum tantum. And then a bond which is both ratified and consummated, and we refer to that as ratum et consummatum, just to use the Latin language of the Code of Canon Law. So then maybe just kind of getting more pertinently to the philosophical and theological heart of the matter. When we describe the bond of marriage itself, we usually describe it in terms like this, or roughly equivalent, that it's permanent, it's faithful, and it's fruitful. So when you enter into a marriage and you make your consent, you consent to a bond which is until death of one of the spouses. Okay, so permanent. So you can't say, misstep. So there's no divorce, like Catholic divorce, as it were. And that's a good little moment for clarification as to what's a a declaration of nullity, or what's an annulment. You might have heard it described in both terms. An annulment is not a Catholic divorce. An annulment is a declaration that the bond, which a man and a woman thought they entered into, never in fact existed, because there was some impediment to, or there was some obstacle to their consent, whether the content of it or the form of it, which they did not overcome. And so in light of that, what they thought to be a marriage wasn't a marriage, all right? And the most typical reason for which that happens is defect of form, where it's a Catholic party enters into a marriage with another individual but doesn't check in with the church at all. So as a Catholic, you are required to have a marriage before, before a bishop or a priest or a deacon, and before two witnesses. You're required to observe Catholic form. And so when you don't do that, we refer to defect of form, and then that is grounds for an annulment. Okay, so the bond into which one enters is permanent, faithful, and fruitful. Faithful in the sense of you just consent to this person and you intend to be sexually exclusive, and fruitful in the sense that you're open to life, right? Procreation and education of the children. Okay, now, zooming in then on the question of the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph, it's evident here that we have a conundrum, because they did not have sexual relations, because it's dogmatically defined that the Blessed Virgin Mary, we read this in the sacred scriptures, that the Blessed Virgin Mary was a virgin before, during, and after the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that part of her bewilderment before the angel Gabriel, as recounted in Luke 1, is that she hasn't had sexual relations with a man, and, based on the church's tradition, we would hold that she intended never to have sexual relations with a man. And so there's a lot of debates in the early church over particular passages, like the word until. She, did not know him until. She did not know man until she came, ... and other things besides, or the description of Mary as betrothed in the Gospel of Luke, and then wife in the Gospel of Matthew. So lots of exchanges over this, like in the 4th and 5th century. But basically, what we say is that they're married. Okay, so that's based on the testimony of Matthew 1 and 2, and like Matthew 1:16, when you do the genealogy there of our Lord Jesus Christ, it refers to Joseph, the husband of Mary. And then in a couple of the dreams that, or in the dream that St. Joseph received at first, and then subsequent dreams, Mary is referred to as his wife. And then it says he took his wife. So we hear it in the words of the genealogist, in the words of the angel, in the words of the narrator of the gospel of this infancy narrative. Still, what do we say about a marriage without intercourse? So St. Thomas clarifies by going to these two ends of marriage. And for St. Thomas, it would have made no sense to say that a thing has two ends. It would say, like, I am destined, to be a star athlete and an astronaut. I suppose you could do both of those things at the same time, but practically speaking, you can't. So tell a better story there, Father Gregory. What do you actually mean? I mean to say, it'd be like saying that I am destined to be both a man and a woman. It's like, no, those are different things. And you can't be both one and the other at the same time and in the same respect. So it's like, yeah, that's a nonsense. So you can't have two ends. It's like saying the end of my journey is both Philadelphia and Nashville. It's like, well, you mean you're going to go to Nashville first and then to Philadelphia? You're going to go to Philadelphia first and then to Nashville? It's like, no, I'm going to go simultaneously to Philadelphia and to Nashville. And it's like, either we're in some freaky science fiction movie or you're speaking nonsense, because you can't have two ends of a journey. Okay, that's probably the better of the examples that I gave. Yes. So then St. Thomas, he's going to clarify with respect to these ends of marriage, because he's going to refer to the first as kind of more like the form of marriage, the shape of marriage, the identity of marriage, and then the second as the goal of marriage or the end of marriage, or kind of like the mission of marriage. And he's going to distinguish between the perfection proper to the first and then the perfection proper to the second. So he'll say that we say a thing is perfect when it's all the way made, basically, or when it's become what it ought to be. But we can say a thing is perfect further still when it acts as, what it ought to be. So, like, you can think about an athlete who's training for a marathon and spends however many months training. He gets to a certain point where he's just in peak physical fitness. But then we want to see him run the marathon, right? We want to see him operate at peak physical fitness within the parameters of his stated goal. Now, if he doesn't run the marathon for whatever reason, let's say, a member of his family dies and he attends the funeral on the day of the marathon rather than run the marathon, we would still say that he's a perfect athlete, okay? He just hasn't operated in a perfect way. He hasn't acted so as to tell forth, to manifest his perfection. So there's two senses then of perfection. We say a thing is perfect, when it gets to that certain point, when it gets to that point where it's fully itself, and then we say it's perfect when it performs those actions proper to its perfection. Okay. So then St. Thomas applies this standard then to what we have called the form of marriage, which we have said, like in the modern context, we talk about the mutual support of the spouses as the form of marriage, and we talk about the end of marriage as the procreation and education of children. St. Thomas has slightly different language, and I find his language to be quite delightful to read and to understand. So he says the form of marriage, like that thing which makes it to be a marriage, is a certain inseparable union of souls by which husband and wife are pledged by a bond of mutual affection that cannot be sundered. Again, a certain inseparable union of souls by which husband and wife are pledged by a bond of mutual affection that cannot be sundered. And the word affection there for him is pretty thick. It's not just like they feel good about it, right? And then they say, yeah, this would be great if we did this for like more days than just today. But we're talking about an inseparable union of souls, which, like the pledge, it's ratified, it's vowed, that testifies to this bond of mutual affection, which cannot be broken, which cannot be sundered. Okay? And then he'll turn to the end of marriage, all right, which he refers to as the begetting and upbringing of children. Procreation and education works just as well. And he breaks out these two divisions. So he'll say that, children are begotten by sexual intercourse, and that children are brought up by the other duties of husband and wife. Okay? So then he says, all right, let's talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph. He says the marriage was absolutely true according to its form, because both consented to the bond. So remember, the form of a marriage, what makes a marriage to be what it is, all right, we're talking about the perfection when a thing comes to be as it should be, the identity of the marriage, is a certain inseparable union of souls by which husband and wife are pledged by a bond of mutual affection that cannot be sundered. And that, the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph had to perfection. All right? Now, he'll say, the marriage was not consummated. Okay, so then when we turn to the end of marriage, he says the begetting and upbringing of children. The first is done by sexual intercourse. The second is done by the other duties of husband and wife. He says we just don't have that first operative perfection, that first acting out of perfection. But he says we do have the second acting out of perfection. Okay, so in effect what you have is the form of marriage is there, whole and entire. And then with respect to the end of marriage, you don't have the procreation of children in the ordinary course, although Mary is fruitful, but you do have the education of children kind of in the ordinary course, as foreseen by. But I think that when you hear this, you're like, that makes enough sense, I suppose, but it's not the type of thing that plays well in argumentation. Because then the question is, what about couples who can't have sex, or don't want to have sex, but want to adopt children, for instance? And at the end of the day, why not same-sex couples? Obviously, there are other things to be introduced into that argument, but you can see how one might bring it to its logical terminus. So if, Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph can go against the law, why not other people? Why not these people just described? And here I think we have to see that it fits within the setting of the divine plan. Okay, so the divine plan is differentiated, and it's not as if God breaks the law, okay? But God is the giver of the law, as himself the eternal law, has a kind of competence over the law, which he himself can clarify as it befits him to do, okay? So this is not just saying God is a God of raw assertion or God is a God of untethered will, but it is to say that God, makes his plans known even when certain activities or certain divine, interjections in sacred history seem strange or they seem like they cut against the grain. So St. Thomas will say in another place that God does nothing contrary to nature, okay? In fact, the nature of a thing is what God does therein. So God is the giver of nature. God acts more naturally to us than we are to ourselves. And yet he does do certain things which are contrary to the normal course of nature, okay? So this is going to apply in, how he commands people to act or comport themselves. It might seem to go against the normal course of virtue. This might be also at play when it comes to transgressions of the law. It's he's not going to command you to break the law in the strict sense, but there might be things which kind of go against the normal course of law-abiding and virtuous comportment. So then, in this other text to which I'm referring, which comes up in the Secunda Secundae, question 104, in a response to an objection, he'll give some dark passages in the sacred scripture where God seems to be doing just this. Okay, so the command given to Abraham to slay his innocent son. He says it wasn't contrary to the virtue of justice, right? It wasn't contrary to the law, prohibiting one to kill. because he'll say, like, God is the author of life and death, and because before God all stand as, liable to punishment because of original sin. So that's really, really dark in terms of an interpretation. And St. Thomas is far more comfortable with giving dark interpretations of dark passages, and that's something that makes us feel really strange. But I repeat it, not to scandalize you, not to throw you for a loop, but simply to say that we need to kind of drill down to the heart of the matter if we're going to answer some of these difficult objections. Excuse me, I'm anticipating the next objections. So here we go. He'll continue in this passage. Saying, nor again was it contrary to justice that he commanded the Jews to take things belonging to the Egyptians. So you remember the scene of the despoiling of the Egyptians right there before the Passover, whatever it is, Exodus 12:13, before they cross over the Red Sea in 14. And he says it's not contrary to law because all things are his, and he gives them to whom he wills. So in St. Thomas's understanding, private property is a kind of concession, as it were, because in light of our original sin, it conduces to good order, it conduces to the upkeep of the goods or possessions, which ought to be shared, by the polity and things like that. So, but he doesn't think that we have a strict right to private property as if the goods of the earth were ours, because they are God's, and he gives them to us, as it were, kind of on loan. And he adds a third example, nor was it contrary to chastity that Hosea was commanded to take an adulteress, because God himself is the ordainer of human generation, and the right manner of intercourse with women is that which he appoints. So you recall in the book of the prophet Hosea, who was a prophet in the 8th century, prophesying to, like Israel, the 10 northern tribes, that there are many sins going up to the high places, idolatry and other things besides, are like to adultery, and so the Lord commands Hosea as a prophetic sign to marry Gomer. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. And they have 3 children whose names are like Jezreel, Lo-Ruhami, or Lo-Ami, Lo-Ruham and Lo-Ami, I think, which means like not my people, and oh gosh, I've forgotten entirely. I got to brush up on the book of the prophet Hosea. My apologies. But he takes the interpretation of this passage pretty seriously. He doesn't think it's just like a kind of image. And so God is commanding him to marry an adulteress, and it doesn't seem like she can commit to a bond which is faithful, which is to say exclusive, because she's shown herself to be weak in this regard. And he's saying that God himself is the ordainer of human generation and the right manner of intercourse with women. So he's saying like it's for God really to determine the specific application here of the law concerning marriage. And at this point, both with the prophet Hosea and with Mary and Joseph, we're talking about a natural institution, because none of these parties are baptized. So we're talking about a kind of marriage which, had its own understanding, or it had its own legislation in the Jewish context, but it's not yet a sacramental marriage as well. So that's also something to keep in mind. So I think that we also have to have in mind the fact that God makes direct interventions in sacred history so as to guide the course of events. That in doing so, he's not going to transgress the law, but that he, as the giver of the law, can work kind of more intimately or more intensely for the fulfillment thereof, like the true heart of it. And you can think in the background of different descriptions of like dispensation or epikeia, ways in which like justice might seem to contravene the law because of the individual himself and the application to the individual, or because of the circumstances in which the law is to be applied, which don't merit a strict application thereof. So God is, he's interposing his divine command in a way that clarifies the law while seeming at first glance to contradict it. So, in the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary and of Saint Joseph, we have a sovereign instance of which, because of the peculiar circumstances of the incarnation and the fitting way in which the only begotten Son of God was to be welcomed among the human race in the womb of a virgin, but presided over by a father, so that he who was with father and mother in the natural course might kind of show us the way, his adopted brothers and sisters, to transfigure that natural course by supernatural means in the story of salvation. So the Lord's, he's not a Disney hero who comes into the world without a father who's been killed by a hunter. The Lord is going to redeem every aspect of our humanity, and the application, as it were, of his providence in this time and in this place is going to take account of all the pertinent circumstances, not leaving anything out, but orchestrating them in such a way that they come to a higher synthesis. So I think you have something of that at stake here in the marriage of the Blessed Virgin Mary and of Saint Joseph. I know it's not entirely satisfying as a response, and it hasn't been for 2,000 years. But I hope that I've given you some of the principles and arguments whereby you can think about it profitably in the context of prayer and study, and then argue about it profitably, whether it be with friends or potential friends. Okay, so that's what I got for you. This, of course, is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, push the bell, get sweet email updates when other things come out. Also, check out Godsplaining, a podcast that I contribute to with 4 other Dominican friars, which is sweet, which I like a lot. Yeah, okay, ... But we've had a lot of episodes about the Blessed Virgin Mary, 3 or 4, in fact. And you can search Godsplaining Mary, and you'll come up with gem upon gem upon gem. And then the last thing is, speaking of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph were hosting a Dominican Rosary pilgrimage on September 30th in Washington, D.C. at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. So it's going to be like, I'm going to give a talk, we're going to have adoration and confessions, a break for lunch, and then I'm going to give another talk, and then we're going to say the Rosary, we're going to have a vigil mass there at the Basilica. It's going to be preached by Father James Brent and celebrated by Father Paul Marich, and the Rosary promoter of the order is going to be there, Father Lawrence Liu. It's going to be a jamboree. And you're going to have the opportunity to meet some of the friars, too, whom you know from the Thomistic Institute, whom you know from Godsplaining, whom you know from other things besides. So really looking forward to meeting you there and to praying with you there. Hope that you're able to come. All right, that's all I got. Know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me, and I'll catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.